Before we begin this Microsoft Digital event, we would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we live and work throughout Australia, as well as the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people viewing this event today. We pay our respects to elders both past, present and emerging, and recognise and celebrate their continuing connection to land, waters and community. Our reverence also extends to all First Nation and Indigenous peoples, as well as their ancestral lands.
Welcome to another episode of New Breakpoint. My name's Simon Waite. We've got a great show lined up for you today on a really hot topic that we're seeing a lot of in our customers at the moment around how you can run Azure App Services anywhere that you can run a Kubernetes cluster. If you do have questions for our presenter while the episode is running today, please make sure to put them into the Q&A window and we'll pick a couple of those questions to answer during a live Q&A at the end of the episode. Otherwise, we'll try and answer them directly in the Q&A window while the episode is running. If you are interested in sharing the episode with people that you know in the industry, keep an eye on your inbox because after a couple of days after the episode, we'll drop you an email. And there will also be show notes available, which will be shared at the end of the episode in the Q&A window as well. So on today's show, I'm going to be joined by Chris Reddington, who's a cloud solution architect in our team in the UK. Really lucky to have Chris here with us. He's a passionate speaker and the topic he's going to cover is a really cool one. So back at Build, we announced the introduction of app services on Azure Arc-enabled Kubernetes clusters. And what this allows you to do is to take the platform as a service offering Azure App Service and run it anywhere that you can run a Kubernetes cluster. I don't want to steal too much of Chris's thunder because he's got a great session lined up for us. So let me get Chris onto the show and we'll get things started. Okay, I'd like to welcome Chris to the show. How are you doing today, Chris?
Hey, Simon. Good, thank you. Thanks for having me. Pleasure to be here.
As I said up top, really looking forward to this subject. I saw it announced at Build. Haven't had to play with it yet myself, so I'm going to really learn some stuff in today's session. Can you tell us a little bit about the role that you have in the team in the UK for Microsoft?
Yeah, sure. So Cloud Solution Architect in the UK. So day to day, what I do is I work with customers, helping them be successful on Azure. And my particular focus area is all about apps. And I think what we're going to be talking about today is just one of the real interest areas that I see coming up in the industry and in the space. So that's why I wanted to bring it here today and talk a little bit about Azure Arc for apps.
All right, you don't need me to hang about to run the rest of the session, so I will slide off of the feed at this point, but I'll be back on at the end of the episode and we'll do some Q&A with Chris while we've got some time with him today. So goodbye for now, and I'll be back a little bit later.
Great, thanks, Simon. So before we jump into Azure Arc for apps, I wanted to just first start talking a bit about Azure Arc, what it is, just in case you haven't heard of it already. So if you think about the challenges of modern day IT, modern day developers, we've got so many different environments that we're going to be working in, whether that's on premises, whether that's multi-cloud, whether that's on the edge. We've got different types of environments. So the servers that we're probably used to working with, Kubernetes clusters, as Simon mentioned a bit earlier, and we've probably got some platform as a service running in there as well. So we've got a mix of these different environments, and trying to manage all of that is pretty tough. And that is the idea behind Azure Arc, is that we have this unified control plane so that we can go ahead and manage that from one place, from the Azure portal. So all of that benefit, all of that love that has gone into the Azure Resource Manager APIs, the Azure Resource Manager providers, being able to use that to manage all of that infrastructure, whether it's on premises, whether it's multi-cloud, whether it's at the edge, and being able to get the best of Azure and manage it through one pane of glass. But of course, we're going to be talking all about developers here today. We're thinking about Azure Arc for apps. So as you can see on the screen here, we've got two different options. We've got Azure Arc-enabled infrastructure, and we've got Azure Arc-enabled services. So think about the Azure Arc-enabled infrastructure as things like those servers or maybe those Kubernetes clusters that might be running in those other environments that you want to manage in some way. And we'll come back to those a bit later. But then on top of those infrastructure, which are enabled by Azure Arc, you can go ahead and deploy services which are typically run in Azure, instead run them on those services outside of Azure. So it's a really interesting idea, particularly when you think about this from an application scenario. So Azure Arc has been around for a little while now. I think if you think back to around September 2020, cast your minds back, that is where the Azure Arc for servers first went generally available. Then in March of 2021, Azure Arc for Kubernetes went generally available. And then the data services aspect of Azure Arc went generally available later on in 2021. And as Simon rightly called out, Build 2021 is when there was the announcement for the application services on top of Azure Arc for Kubernetes clusters. And that's what we're going to focus on here today. But before we focus on those application aspects, let's first just focus on the Kubernetes aspect for a moment. And that will be part of the demo that we look at here today as well. But ultimately, as Simon mentioned, you've got a Kubernetes cluster that might be running in another cloud. It might be running on the edge. It might be running on premises, for example. As long as that Kubernetes cluster is CNCF conformant, so according to the Cloud Native Compute Foundation, it should be compliant with Azure Arc. And really the idea with Azure Arc is an agent gets installed on that cluster, and then you can go and manage that from the Azure portal, that cluster. So think about things like using Azure policies to restrict what images, for example, can be brought down onto that Kubernetes cluster, and other different policies that you could go and configure there. How about managing your deployments at scale by using things like GitOps, for example? Well, again, that's now something that you can do. If that Kubernetes cluster has the Azure Arc-enabled Kubernetes agent running on it, then awesome. You can now go ahead and manage the configuration of your clusters, the applications deployed onto it at a Kubernetes level by using GitOps on Azure Arc as well. So there's a lot of interesting ideas that this can open up from an inventory perspective, a monitoring perspective, but it's this layer that enables the application piece. And this application piece is really interesting because as developers, if you think about that problem that we started with from the very beginning, we've got many different environments that we're going to be working in now. We've got many different types of platforms, maybe different hosting providers. From a developer perspective, what I care about is I want to be productive. I want to make the best application that I can so that I can give an awesome end user experience to all of my users. And if I have to start thinking of different environments and different platforms that I'm deploying my application onto, that gets a bit challenging. That starts getting in the way of me being productive as a developer. Wouldn't it be awesome if rather than thinking of those different platforms, I could just deploy to application services or Azure Functions, Logic Apps on any of those platforms? But not just those application services, but also things like your API management gateways, also things like Event Grid as well. This is all possible and enabled by this Azure Arc application services scenario. So what we'll see here with the application side is all in preview right now, but you can see the direction that this is all going in, and it's a really exciting space. So what we're going to do first is we're going to jump into a demo. And this demo is all about setting up that Kubernetes cluster. So what you see here is I'm in the Azure portal, and I have an Azure Kubernetes service cluster. This could be any Kubernetes cluster, as I mentioned, that is conformance to the Cloud Native Compute Foundation. And what we're going to do first is we're just going to show that this is a basic default cluster. There's no workloads running on it except for the system defaults, if you like. So everything that enables the cluster to run. Now, at this point, what we can go and do is we can go ahead and configure Azure Arc for that Kubernetes cluster. Really simple. All we need to do is jump into the Azure portal and look for Kubernetes Azure Arc. We then get a wizard experience, a click-through experience, just like we used to in the Azure portal. And we have a couple of prerequisites there. So an existing Kubernetes cluster, the Azure CLI, some extensions, having Helm installed. But most importantly, having the appropriate permissions to that Kubernetes cluster. Because the context which we run the commands that we'll see in a moment is ran in the context of our current kube config. So do be mindful of that. So you can see this all looks just like any other Azure resource creation experience. But what we're doing here is effectively setting up the resource for the Azure Arc-enabled Kubernetes cluster. So providing some tags there, which is a great best practice there to go and follow. And you can see at the end of that, we get these set of commandlets which have been presented for us to go and use. This last commandlet here, along with the resource group creation, is how we then go ahead and create that Azure Arc resource. So if I just go and paste this into my terminal, you can see here that we're just going to go ahead, run that command. And that'll take a few minutes to go and run. And this is why it's really important to make sure your local environment has got the right kube config set, because this is now going to run some commands to install the agent on that cluster. That agent is then going to register itself to Azure against that resource that has been created. And then eventually you will see that the Kubernetes cluster successfully connects to Azure, as we can see here. So we can see from the resource screen that we have an AKS distribution. We can see what version of Kubernetes we're running, what agent version as well. And it looks just like any other Azure resource. Now, I know in this example I am using AKS, but imagine if that was a Kubernetes cluster running in another cloud, running on the edge, running on premises. The fact you can go and manage that from the Azure portal is pretty cool. So if we now look at the pods on the Kubernetes cluster, you can see we have a number of components relating to Azure Arc that have all been installed. You can see a couple of the options that we mentioned earlier about GitOps, for example, the ability to be able to configure our application deployments, the ability to use Azure policies, for example, against our Kubernetes cluster. Again, not running in Azure necessarily at this point. So there's lots of great things that we can do to make sure we're protecting the workloads that are running on top of our Kubernetes cluster there. Now that's all great. But I mentioned in the very beginning, we're going to be talking about application services. We're going to be talking about these extra features almost that you can go and enable on your Kubernetes cluster here as well. So let's just go ahead and dive into that in a bit more detail. And before we do, I just want to work on some key concepts here with you first. So the first one being this concept of an Azure Arc-enabled Kubernetes cluster extension. That's a lot of words. What does that mean? Well, we've just looked at what an Azure Arc-enabled Kubernetes cluster is. We take a Kubernetes cluster, we install the Azure Arc agent onto it, and we're able to manage that through Azure. Cluster extensions are a concept for these Azure Arc-enabled Kubernetes clusters. And what they do is they're a way to be able to effectively think about it like a plugin, think about it like an additional set of functionality where you can go and install that using the Azure Resource Manager experience. So that might be things like Azure Monitor, Azure Defender for Kubernetes, or the application services that we're going to be talking about here. So think about app services, think about Event Grid, think about your API management gateways. All of those can be installed as extensions onto that Azure Arc-enabled Kubernetes cluster. But again, take a step back for a moment, because you're going to have to deploy your application services, so your app services, your functions, etc., to that Kubernetes cluster. That Kubernetes cluster is not an Azure region. because when you deploy your Azure resources, you have to choose an Azure region where those resources will be deployed. So this is where the concept of a custom location comes in. And a custom location is effectively a way for you to go and map a custom location, as the name implies, with your Azure Arc-enabled Kubernetes cluster. So that way, when you get to creating an app in the Azure portal, the experience is just the same, apart from you go and select a custom location instead of an Azure region. So with that context, let's go and jump in and look at the second part of the demo here. So here we are back with our Azure Arc-enabled Kubernetes cluster. And you can see we're just going to go ahead and take a look at the extensions here. We've got 4 different extensions: the API Management Gateway, we've got the Application Services extension for app services, Azure Functions, etc. Azure Arc Data Controller, which is the more data services focused extension. And then we've got Event Grid on Kubernetes as well. So let's go ahead and walk through creating the App Services extension. Again, it just looks like the experience when we create any other Azure resource. We give that instance a name. We have to create this custom location that we just talked about a moment ago. So we go and give that some friendly name there. We then have to go ahead and set up some other configuration specific for this extension. Now, of course, the installation experience will differ per each extension that you use. And all of these extensions from the app's perspective are in preview right now. So just be mindful as you go through and use those there. But here you can see I'm configuring my static IP. I'm setting up my storage class. I'm doing all of those types of pieces to enable app services here. We then go ahead, we enable a log analytics workspace here as well. In fact, I'm going to go ahead and create a new one. And this effectively then enables all of the pieces that you would expect, having your monitoring set up, having all of those core components to enable those app services to run. Now, this is effectively the process to spin up our own stamp, if you like, of app services on the Kubernetes cluster. So being able to imagine running a public multi-tenant app service, but instead running it on our own Kubernetes cluster. Now you can see that we had a load of scripts outputted at the ends there. Those are outputted in Azure PowerShell. I actually have a preference personally for Azure CLI, so that's what I'm going to go ahead and use in my terminal here as well. That's all well documented in the Azure docs. So if you're interested in following along and doing this for yourself, go ahead, take a look at the Azure docs, and we've got a couple of links at the ends of the show here as well. Now, I'm not expecting anyone to read through all of this as I'm demoing this and going line by line, looking at each step here. But the real important piece to understand is, A, you've got cluster extensions, B, you've got this custom location concept, and then C, you need to create this App Services Kubernetes resource to map the extension back to a Kubernetes resource then, or an App Service Kubernetes resource, I should say. And this will take a little bit of time to get things set up. But once you've gone ahead and done that, what you'll see in the Azure portal is this extension is creating here. So we can see that's pending, and we just need to wait for that to go ahead and complete. Takes a few minutes in my experience, but then once that's complete, you can progress with the rest of the installation of the base environment there then. The remainder of the installation then is all about setting up that custom location, creating that app service Kubernetes environment as well. So if we jump back to the portal, we refresh, we can see the cluster extension has been installed. Brilliant. So this is where we then go ahead and create that custom location. Notice in the custom location, we're mapping that to the cluster extension so that the Azure resource provider and ARM overall knows that when there's a resource creation request, where to go and route that resource creation request to. This is the magic behind how some of this works, because if you think about it, all that Azure does when you go ahead and create one of those resources and deploy it to an Azure region is it routes the request to the right region. But here, that request needs to be routed to a Kubernetes cluster. So here we go. We're going through some of the final steps. We're creating this app service Kubernetes resource here. Again, that'll take a little bit of time to get things set up. But once that's all done, then you'll go ahead and jump back into the Azure portal, and you'll be able to see there we have this app service Kubernetes environment as well as the custom location here. So that's great. We've got that base infrastructure set up. We can now go ahead and create an app service or an Azure function just like we would for a multi-tenant app service, for an app service environment, for example. But before we do, I just want to quickly show you what this looks like on the Kubernetes cluster. So if we now look at all pods once again, you may have caught at the bottom of the screen there are a couple of app service components. Now we'll take a look at those again once we've created an application. So if you see here, we're just going and creating an app service, a web app, the same way we would in the Azure portal. Notice right now we're pointing to Central US, but notice that I've got this custom location now available. Did you see how that URL changed, that domain record, which is going to be generated for us? Now, one thing to note and to be careful of is which runtime stack you're using, or whether you're using a container, whether it's Linux or Windows, determines whether that can be deployed on your Kubernetes cluster. So you'll notice as I play with some of the configuration options here that the option of being in the custom location, the Kubernetes cluster, might appear or disappear. So you'll just need to make sure you're choosing the right combination that can go onto a Kubernetes cluster here. So at this point then, we walk through the creation experience. We can go and hit create. I'm going to jump across onto this screen once again. Notice at the very bottom, we've got a couple of things which are pending there. And just going to just pause us for a moment there so you can take that in. What we've got running on that cluster, if you take a look at the kind of bottom half of that screen there right now, are the app services components that enable app service to run on that Kubernetes cluster. Then the bottom one there, which is like Chris app-77, etc., is my application that is running. So for any of you who are familiar with Kubernetes, these are all just containers running on my Kubernetes cluster. I can now jump in to the Azure resource in the Azure portal. It looks exactly like any other app service resource that I'll have seen. So I can go ahead, open a new tab. I can go and visit the page of that application running, for example. But I can also go ahead and run some of those other features that I get in app services as well. Because again, as a developer, I care about focusing on my application and bringing that innovation and being able to write awesome code. So things like PaaS enable me to do that. For example, using the Easy Auth functionality that is available with app services. Being able to enable an identity provider, app service deals with that for me, and my app is protected. Well, guess what? That same functionality works the exact same way you're used to from app service as it does in app service on an Azure Arc-enabled Kubernetes cluster. So if we just hit refresh on that page, you can see I get my prompt for the Azure AD authentication there as well. Now, given that this is in preview, there are some differences between app service and what is available in Azure Arc-enabled Kubernetes app service right now. So as you can see here, we're just taking a look at what is running on the Kubernetes cluster once again, which containers or which pods are running. And you can see here, if we just pause this for a sec, you can see here that that Chris app that we deployed earlier now has a sidecar running. So there's 2 of 2 pods running. And one of those sidecars is that authentication experience that we just enabled there a moment ago. So now let's go ahead and take a look at actually scaling out our application, because we might want to go and create more instances a bit later to serve more users, for example. So we'll just go ahead, we'll go and run get pods again, but we'll watch those pods. So we'll see as new things are getting created in that namespace in our Kubernetes cluster. Again, like we're used to, we can go ahead, use that slider, drag it across, drag it back, hit save. And what we'll see on the Kubernetes cluster is all of our pods, all of our containers creating there. So we can see they're initializing, they're now running. And I've now got 10 instances of that application, which is an app service app running on my Azure Arc-enabled Kubernetes cluster. A really awesome experience here, showing how all of that love and investment that has come from the app service space is now able to be used in those Azure Arc-enabled Kubernetes clusters, whether I'm running that on the edge, on premises, or in a multi-cloud environment there as well. So this is just one piece of the puzzle. We've just been focusing on app services right here. Of course, we could run Azure Functions in that same environment. We could run Logic Apps in that same environment as well. Again, you'll need to go ahead and have a little try of those to understand what features there will be working as you expect them today. But there's so much more than just the app services side of things. There's API management gateways that you can go and host in your Azure Arc-enabled Kubernetes cluster. There's Event Grid as well. And what I've done here, just to make it easier, we'll make sure it's in the show notes as well, is linking to those various doc pages and the announcements, and also a Microsoft Learn module to get started with some of this as well. So it's been a pleasure to talk with you all about Azure Arc-enabled Kubernetes clusters, about running your application services on top of those clusters. Simon, back to you.
Okay, thanks a lot for that, Chris. That was a great demo. Some really interesting insights there into what's coming down the pipe, particularly when it comes to the app services enablement on top of Kubernetes using Azure Arc. Like you showed, I think that consistency of experience is going to be absolutely important for the success of this, and is a real driver in why we're delivering this capability. I know in that demo you were going through a few scenarios, and I noticed on the deployment of an app service onto your infrastructure once it was laid down on top of Kubernetes, there was some choices there that depending on what type of runtime you chose and type of deployment that you chose, that you could or couldn't deploy it onto the Arc-enabled Kubernetes cluster. I was just wondering, so I can see there that you've got on screen, just some limitations for the preview. Did you maybe just want to talk a little bit more about that? Things like Windows containers and process support and things like that.
Yeah, sure. And there's a great set of FAQs on this page as well. So again, we'll make sure those are in the show notes here. But really what it boils down to, all of the built-in Linux stacks are supported. But right now, Windows apps are not supported. So that's just something to keep in mind that unfortunately right now, that's something you won't be able to do.
So I know that, a lot of our customers and developers who work in regulated industries would be familiar with, the construct of an app service environment. But I can see that there might be a lot of interest in, those organizations embracing something like this as a way forward. What's the story that you're aware of, or, where you've seen maybe the drive going with app service environment versus, app services on Kubernetes in this scenario?
Sure. I think typically when I think of those app services environments, I see the super high scale or super high compliance needs is really the drivers that I see for app service environments. But Azure Arc-enabled Kubernetes and the app services running on top of those, remember that that's not just necessarily running your workloads in Azure anymore. It's running it at the edge, running it on premises, running it in a multi-cloud environment. So I think there's still a story for both, and there's still a reason to use either or. I think the benefit we now get as developers is that consistent deployment approach and that deployment mechanism towards those different target environments. So I'm sure there'll be more to come, but it makes our lives easier as developers, at least.
It's just that consistency story, right? I think a lot of people are always cautious about committing to a new way of doing things, albeit, App Service is very open in terms of how it supports web applications. If you're building modern stateless enterprise web apps, then App Service is really a great place to run those workloads today. But again, things like Easy Auth, for example, there might be a catch there where you want to invest time in building that. Now you can do that without necessarily having to run on, Azure PaaS services to do that. Absolutely. Look, I am conscious of time, Chris. I really want to thank you for your time today. Unfortunately, Chris won't be joining us for the live Q&A because we're going to let him go and get some sleep because it's super early in the morning where he is at the moment. So we want to thank him for joining us for this presentation. But do stick around. We've got some local folks from our cloud solution architecture team here in Australia who are going to take live questions from the audience. But Chris, again, wanted to thank you very much for today. We'll put your contact details on social media and LinkedIn and what have you into the show notes. And we'll also grab all of the great information you've shared in the slides today and during this Q&A section, and we'll make sure they go into the show notes. But thanks for joining us today, Chris.
No, pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me, Simon.